Hello, Endeavor here. So today I have a very interesting conversation, and I have some special guests here from South Africa. We're going to be talking about the situation in South Africa today, and I'm joined by the gentleman from the Boer Republic. How are you guys doing today?
Great, thanks. And yourself? Thanks for the pleasure to be on the show. We appreciate it.
So I'm going to start by saying, I'm glad to have you on. And I'm just going to start off by saying that about a year ago, I was actually in South Africa, and it truly is an extraordinary place. I'll never forget my visit to the Cecil Rhodes Memorial in Cape Town. I'll never forget the view overlooking the Cape from about 4 p.m. It was really something that was amazing. And I do think South Africa is truly an amazing country. But needless to say, if you've been following the news, you'll know that it's not in the best shape at the moment. And with the recent news of land expropriation without compensation, it's looking like they're going to change the constitution, and that might go through. So I'll let you guys start off. What's the real situation in South Africa today, and what's really going on right now?
Look, the situation in general is a very there's a lot of fear, a lot of tension. There's quite a bit of confusion as to what exactly expropriation without compensation entails. And in many respects, the rhetoric coming from the ANC, the governing party, as well as any additional parties, which are mostly Marxist, communist, the rhetoric coming from them is a constant battering in the media of, we must take the land that's been stolen from us, in quotes. And the us that's there is usually the idea of who belongs, what belongs to whom is very sketchy. So at the moment, especially in our media, there's a lot of confusion regarding that specific topic. And our president just came out recently saying that the objective of going through with expropriation without compensation must go through. So to just give an idea, we've basically got a month left, August. At the end of August, the final decision will be made as to will land be expropriated without compensation or not. But we can discuss the details that in much more detail a bit later. But that's just to give an idea, is that even the ruling parties in South Africa are pushing an agenda, and it's fueling lots of tension and confusion over here.
I think if you can summarize it in a way that in the last years and everything, all the parties basically contesting the top spot have been trying to change the narrative about South African history. There's I wouldn't say you can call it debate, but it's basically the mainstream media pushing this agenda, pushing this narrative to kind of fuel the hate amongst the majority. And obviously the result of that has been a white flight out of the country, and that you could say is coming to or it feels like it is coming to a boil at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that there has been a lot of talk about South Africa in right-wing circles in the West, so outside of South Africa. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux have both talked about it extensively. Lauren Southern did a documentary there. But I feel that they really missed the mark, where I think you guys got it right. I've listened to a few of your podcasts, in that I don't think that the situation, the problem in South Africa is necessarily a communism problem or even a racial problem. That kind of just seems to be the surface, when I think that the deeper problem is a democracy problem.
No, I mean it's always more complicated than to put it down to one thing. Or people always want to simplify it. You have to obviously see it in the historical context. I mean the documentary Lauren Southern did was still a very good documentary, and it did touch on some good points. It is in one way difficult to say that that it is not a racial issue. There's race permeates, or racial tension permeates through the whole culture. So it is difficult. But the democracy, I mean, there's no real democracy here for what it's worth. We'll obviously get into that, but you're right. There's definitely a problem with the democratic process, and it has shown that it is definitely not working. But that is more based upon the demographics of the population of South Africa.
Yes, and in 1994, South Africa was kind of seen as the ultimate triumph of liberalism, the ultimate triumph of equal democracy, of it being finally made to work in a country like South Africa, a country with such a long history of racial conflict. But I think that kind of what we're seeing now, and I think what we're going to see is really in South Africa is the ultimate failure of liberalism. In that, like you guys pointed out, that there's all these problems with democracy in with race in South Africa, but with democracy as the system, it kind of makes that conflict inevitable.
Well, if you look at the way the idea of democracy came about, if you look back in history, you've got Athenian democracy, and that was very ethnic oriented. It was a very it was based on, and it was kept in check by many factors, like only white male citizens who were involved with the city-state could own land, and the entire culture was based around a certain ethnicity or an idea of being Athenian. So that idea, and I mean, if you look at what democracy originally was, we're so far away from that currently. And like you say, yes, demographics is a huge problem where democracy is concerned. And to give an idea, here in South Africa, your listeners might be very aware of the ways the US works, or even Canada, where there's a white majority of various nationalities or from various European origins. But over here, the whites are a minority. They are the most productive minority, but they are a minority compared to a huge populace of various Bantu-speaking tribes or Bantu-speaking black people, and there's a huge difference in the democratic process here compared to other Western countries. Democracy is a sham here because everyone votes according to identity politics anyway, and most voters are ill-informed when it comes to certain aspects.
Yeah, and I mean that one thing that kind of the idea in 1994 was that they were going to do away with those divisions over identity politics. But I mean that really kind of hasn't happened. A lot of ways, it's really kind of been more emboldened, and even recently, I mean, you can just see from the news with land expropriation without compensation. You'll see with people like the EFF, Julius Malema, with all the outlandish comments he makes, and it kind of seems like this is what's actually winning votes for the ANC and the EFF. Would you agree?
Yeah. So I mean, the one aspect, just as you touched on that, although we would not like to see or like to choose, from a libertarian standpoint, you wouldn't like to choose amongst racial lines here because, our politicians use such racial rhetoric, stuff that would never go in any other Western country. They're allowed to say things, obviously singing songs like "Shoot the Boer," and it has become the norm. It is really, if you're not here, you don't understand. Like it is normal rhetoric every day to spew over white hatred, and in a way for us, it is, in a sense, it doesn't matter really what you do. I mean, the democratic process is not gonna change anything because the politicians, they use the race card, and they've done for such a long time that you've got such a built up of sort of hate and entitlement in the population that you have to deal with that. You kind of have to deal amongst racial lines because of the intense build-up up to this time. So Sorry, that was just kind of my point in that sense, is that we would like to kind of take race out of it, but because the politicians use it so powerfully, and we kind of all know they just want votes. I mean, we all know that, but in a sense, they are willing to push the country in, to sort of a race war, because you can't sow so much hate for so long without an effect. And we all know it's a ploy, but in the end, the ploy leads to destruction.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
just to,
yes, go ahead.
sorry, just to add to that, when the expropriation without compensation debate started, when it started hitting the news, when Cyril Ramaphosa came into power, there was this part in his rhetoric that he used: we must go forth with expropriation without compensation for our people. And that's one thing that foreign audiences must understand, is when politicians like that use, oh, we must go forth and obtain this for our people, or we must do this for our people, there is a clear, well, it's implied, but it's clear that a certain identity is being spoken of, or a certain ethnicity is being spoken of in favor of another. And identity politics has taken the fore. I mean, it's become quite global. But that specifically, that our people is a huge issue, because it forces you to either be on the favored side or the disfavored side, and it's not always stated definitely or explicitly, but when politicians say things like that, it is anti-white, because of the fact that the people that are being targeted fall under what would be European descendants. So that's where people come up, and that's where we need to stand up for our own identity, because no one else is going to. And we are so atomized at the same time. And it's a phenomenon throughout the Western world too, is aspects of pathological altruism, sort of that more individualized, atomized aspect of Western culture. And that's that notion, or that phenomenon, is just as prevalent here in South Africa.
Yeah, and I kind of know what you mean when because when Cyril Ramaphosa says our people, he's not talking about the Afrikaners, of course. He's talking about the Bantus. And I think you guys brought up that you wish you could take ethnicity out of the problem. And I think I was kind of in the same boat about maybe about a year or two ago. I probably would have said the same thing. But I think kind of just seeing the way that the world's going, and I mean, it's nowhere near where in Canada or the United States is nowhere near where it is in South Africa. But I think that I kind of really have come to understand that is the way of that is kind of the way that it's going to work in a multicultural society, and that if you don't play kind of play the card of our people, then you're going to lose by default, because the people that are playing by that, they're going to win that fight every time.
Yeah, I mean, this is, as you said, if you want to see democracy in action over 100 years, we're a beautiful example of what democracy is. It is mob rule, and if you look at sort of the emotions at play here, it's basically a nation. A majority of a nation that feels they were oppressed and enslaved. Obviously, that's not even true that they were enslaved, but they were oppressed for a long time, and now this is revenge. So we're living at sort of the start of, or some people, it feels like the end, but the beginning of their era of revenge. That is what it feels. And if you have demographics that are so skewed to one side, then that element of mob rule that is democracy really comes up. And that is where, other countries are different, where it's a homogenous country. And, it always seems, take the States, for example, it seems like it is always about a 50-50 share between the two, Democrats and Republicans. But yeah, it's obviously a massive majority vote for the ANC in comparison.
Yeah, because I mean, the narrative in South Africa really is what's driving it. It's a very deep cultural narrative, and in ways, I think it's actually very similar to the narrative in the West, in here in North America, in Canada and the United States. But it seems it's the same narrative, but on steroids, and the demographics are flipped. Whereas instead of the white majority oppressing the black minority, according to the narrative, it's the other way around. It's the white minority oppressing the majority. And I mean, when that's the cultural narrative, it kind of, and you know, when you're under a democratic system where it's really just a zero-sum game. So I mean, there's only a certain amount of votes, and really kind of everyone's interests are just competing with each other. It kind of just seems inevitable that that's kind of what we're seeing now, and maybe what we're going to see in the coming months and years. I think it's kind of it kind of just makes it inevitable.
That's also a very good point to make, is especially when the demographics or the population demographics are flipped here in South Africa. That doesn't mean that the ideologies get flipped. So what you'd, for instance, have in universities in Canada and America, you'd have things like transgenderism. You'd have issues that, you know, which pronouns do you use, or you know, who's oppressing who. You know, the oppression Olympics that's so often found overseas. Those ideologies are transplanted just like that here in South African institutions. So then it becomes this issue as if South Africa had a white majority that oppressed everyone, and it's simply not the case. But the ideologies itself get transplanted here to South Africa. So you'd find things like some of the more, you know, what would be like woke students saying, you know, but we've been oppressed, we've been this and that. And you can easily just the word apartheid, you can just take like that and put in, for instance, the Holocaust, or you could even put in the relations in the South of America with the idea of apartheid. You can just transplant those words, and in the minds of many, it means exactly the same thing. So unfortunately, the way it runs on this side is we are the minority, but you know, there's so much ideologically, as well as with some of the laws that are in place. Like, for instance, you would have had, or in the US, there would have been, you know, civil rights movements and laws like laws that would favor minorities to be able to get work. And that same affirmative action laws, those same affirmative action laws are in place or are in favor of the majority here in South Africa who aren't white. So, you know, there are many things that are played against us when it comes to demographics, when it comes to the democratic process.
I think,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, just to give some background to that. If you look at sort of the welfare state in a way here, I think it got about 13% of taxpayers carry the rest of the country literally on social grants, which goes out to about 40 to 50% of the country. And I think if you take it down to smaller numbers, about 1% pays 61% of the tax. So you've got a very small, and then the white population is about 7% and decreasing about 1% a year. So that you can make a quite sad projection there. But just to put it into context, how overburdened the taxpayer is, and that obviously creates a much more volatile situation.
Yes, because well, like one thing that they talk about a lot is equality. They'll say, well, you know, in places like Canada and the United States, what they say is, well, you know, you kind of the white majority, well, we just want equality with them. We want to even the playing field. And they'll say, like, you know, it's the history of racism and all this stuff. And I mean, and I think what South Africa goes to show is that when that's flipped, I mean, you're not going to expect the same. You're not going to expect the same treatment, because it seems like as if I mean, because it is true that in South Africa the the white population still is richer than the black population. But I think that it really kind of seems to be that when it flips, it's now, well, we need to kind of enact some kind of revenge against it. I mean, it just seems like there's going to be no satisfying this kind of narrative.
Sure, like how do you put in place laws? I mean, it's the same like with reparations. How do you quantify revenge? How do you quantify forgiveness? And it's with these laws. Like if you had 40 years of apartheid, let's say, like how many years of affirmative action? How many years are you going to apply these affirmative action, what we call BEE laws, where literally it makes it more difficult for the minority white to get employment? So how long are you going to enact that? Are you going to enact that 40 years, 50 years? Like, or are you going to enact it literally to the point of equality, which is, I think, the ideology, which means we're going to enact it to the point that everyone's starving, which is what communism is. So hence, as we say, it's not as openly as if, obviously no politician openly says we're going to create a communist state. Obviously, sometimes they actually make that slip up here, but it is where it ends, and in a sense, it is the ideology behind sort of the front that they give.
Yeah, because it's with the blank slate. So as in kind of the ideology really of egalitarianism, and that really is in place in both South Africa and in the West, is that the only reason that there is any inequality, it's because of oppression. So they say that like the narrative really is that if it wasn't for history of racism in America, then everyone would have been equal, and then none of the inequalities today would have happened. And yeah, I mean, it really kind of goes on in that it really can kind of go on indefinitely, because let's be honest here, land expropriation without compensation, I mean, who's that really going to benefit? Is it going to benefit the poor black Africans living in squatter camps, or the ANC party officials? I mean, and even after that, the narrative is just going to continue to go on.
Now, the thing is with that specifically is, and you've touched upon this previously, there's a huge competition for the ANC from the EFF side, because the EFF spouts rhetoric that appeals to the lower classes, the poor and disenfranchised, what would be classified as that. And they're promising to just give them, it's Gibbs, essentially, and that appeals to the most of the population. So what happens is the ANC is then basically trying to save itself, and they're basically matching the EFF's rhetoric, which ultimately adds to the tension, because the ANC is trying to save itself. Over the years, we've had many ANC politicians leaving the ANC and forming other parties, such as the Congress of the People, COPE. It's a very small party, but they have many members that used to be part of the ANC that don't fully align with what's being done there. So that entire process is in itself a farce when it comes to the promises that gets made. Just to give a further idea, all the politicians that are spouting for expropriation without compensation are themselves millionaires, and the president himself is in US dollars, he's a billionaire. No, in South Africa, in rand, he's a billionaire. So he's able to give everyone in the country a million rand or so just to get by if he really wanted to. And most of those politicians have farmlands. So why can't they, if they care about their people, why not expropriate their own property without compensation first? Now, even state-owned land is a hugely debatable subject, purely because the government itself is sitting on a huge amount of farmlands, but those farmlands are sitting empty. They are not being used. They're wasting away. Why not use those? Why not use that land first before you start taking away or spouting rhetoric to take away other land. It's a murky, uh, very murky bit of propaganda that the ruling government is spouting out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it kind of plays into the real irony of the kind of the culture that we have right now, in that, I mean, the main cultural narrative, both here and in South Africa, is egalitarianism. It's that, like, we view equality as like this ultimate good. But I mean, the real irony is that in South Africa is one of the most unequal places in the world economically, and the United States is the same way. It's extremely unequal economically, but then you'll have these what we call them champagne socialists. So people like John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Anne Hathaway, all these people that they'll go out and say, white privilege, this, history of oppression, that we want equality, this, that. But I mean, and a lot of the people that are driving these narratives are really themselves extremely wealthy, and certainly not willing to give up anything of their own to kind of fulfill this so-called equality. And I mean, I think that one thing that South Africa kind of proves also is that it tends to really take more of the critical theory school of Marxism rather than traditional Marxism, which was based on class struggle. Because I mean, like you said, the ANC party officials, these guys are billionaires, yet they're constantly talking about equality, even though it's one of the most unequal countries in the world.
Yeah, the big thing about that is also the ANC, since they came into power, they've been promising housing for the poor. They've been promising injustices for the poor, to fix injustices for the past. It's, it's 2018. People are even poorer than what they used to be. There are so many squatter camps all over the country, white and black, and no one sees this promise that the ANC or the EFF, the promises that these guys put forth to the people to say, but if you vote for us, this is what we'll give you. And they simply just take that money and spend it on themselves. That it's very much the same mentality that you'd find throughout Africa, where once the colonies were given independence, it turned into tribal. There was one guy came up the top, and he was the warlord, and it's the same situation here, just with a bit more of a better constitution, but the process is the same. Our former president looked after his own people the same way. There was a huge scandal where he built a huge property for him and his 5,000 wives and children. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but still, he looked after his own people with taxpayer money. And that money didn't go to the poor of the country, or at least the poor blacks. I mean, if you are spouting rhetoric that says, oh, but we want to look after our people, at least be consistent and do something. But the ANC doesn't really do much except talk.
Yeah, and I think that what really makes it kind of a deadly situation, though, is that with kind of that cultural narrative of the white oppressor, it'll always be blamed. It'll always be blamed on the whites in South Africa, because the narrative that's really been built up is that the only reason for inequality is because of apartheid. It's because of the histories of oppression, and pretty much, I mean, it's the same in Zimbabwe, that no matter how bad the situation gets, it'll always end up defaulting to that narrative. I mean, like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. I mean, till the day that he was overthrown, and when there was basically no white people left in Zimbabwe, he was still blaming it on colonialism. He was still blaming it on the Rhodesians. And I mean, these narratives, they kind of just go on forever.
Yeah, it's for me, it's fascinating, and you touch a great point. There is no counter narrative. If you listen to any mainstream newspaper here in this country, in any radio station ever, there is never any talk of a counter narrative, and that is one aspect which we try, when we've talked about that previously on our podcast, is someone has to provide some counter narrative, and you have to look into different things. And you've looked into genetics, you've looked into IQ, and you could just look into culture. Here, we don't really see it as a demographic, a democracy failure. It is a clash of cultures. There is a difference here between black and white culture. Black culture generally is more collective, and obviously white culture is more individualistic. And when, in a sense, when that clashes in an economy, then when the collective cultural group has control, then they're always going to win.
Yeah, because because yeah, an individual always lose to a collective, and kind of when even in the West, you're really seeing that, and that a lot of these, if you guys know who Jean-Francois Garipay and Frame Games are, they made
Yes.
they made a multiple part series about just how much power a lot of these minority interest groups have, and just how much weight they're able to apply to these massive corporations, and just how much money's involved. And I mean, it kind of, I mean, and one of the real arguments we have online, and kind of the right, and kind of the center between people, say on the center right, and maybe someone like myself, is that, well, I mean, my argument is that if you don't come to the table, if you don't stand together as a group, and you don't come to the table, if you try to have this kind of like individualist society where you just kind of try to get rid of all the differences, you're gonna lose, because your opponents have no incentive to do so, because what they're doing is, it's so effective politically.
Yeah, and that's the thing. You can't sit on the fence anymore, and that's just, politics. The lines become between politics and culture and ethnicity almost become blurred here, and that's where it becomes a case of, you can't just sit on the fence anymore. You have to take a stand, because even if you don't participate, you will, if, let's say, the hypothetical race war kicks off, when you've got an enraged mob coming at you, and you're one single shop owner, or just a guy on the street, what would inevitably happen is that group isn't going to stop and ask you, what are your politics? How do you feel about this and this topic? Let's have a quick debate before we kill you. That's not going to happen. It's literally a case of, when you've got an enraged mob on whichever demographic, the demographic is irrelevant in this specific example. It's just that the mob isn't going to wait before they attack you. And this is where it becomes a case of, you have to become aware, if it's a matter of race realism, or if it's just a matter of the politics of your culture, or what's natural for your culture. That's when you have to start making some difficult choices.
Yeah, because there seems to be kind of three different camps, I guess, amongst the white populations in the West. It's that, so we have there's first the white progressives, or the shit libs, as we might call them. It's the anti-white white people, the ones who like denounce themselves. They talk about white privilege because it makes them feel kind of virtuous. It makes them kind of like because it's not really rational. It's just that it makes them feel good emotionally, even as long as they don't have to give anything up in order to do it, and that's the key. Then you'll have
there's no risk factor involved. That's the thing. Is
exactly.
they're usually very much drawn away, or kept away from those risks. And if you're on the ground and you're faced with those risks every day, then the reality kicks in pretty hard.
Yes, and then there's kind of like the center, maybe center left, center right, and this is kind of actually is the mainstream conservative opinion, is that we should just try to treat everyone as individuals. We should just kind of try to make it so that we don't really think too much about race. We don't really think too much about identity politics. We try to avoid it, and really just kind of hope that we are able to integrate everyone. And then there's kind of the dissident right. There's kind of which would be called the far right, which, I mean, I would probably be associated with. Is that what I'm saying is that you really need to you're going to need to group up, because if you don't, you're going to be teamed up on. And I think one great saying I heard was that, you might not care about race, but race kind of cares about you. And I mean, what I would just want to say, I think you're totally right, is though that with the white liberals in places like Canada or the US, if in the future, I mean, I don't think that they're really going to make a distinction between the ones that said that they acknowledge their white privilege, and the ones that and the ones that grouped up together. I mean, there isn't going to be this this like tribunal to test if a white person's racist or not. I mean, that you're kind of just grouped up. You're kind of just grouped up that way, and I mean, with things like critical race theory, which is taught in our public schools, it says it's every white person. It even says in it that you don't even have to like dislike other ethnicities to be racist according to this theory, and it kind of just goes on forever.
Yeah, the big issue we have here, sorry, and as you said, it's I like how you say, like it's the collective will always win against the individual, and here you as an individual don't stand a chance, because it is written in law to discriminate against you as a collective. So you don't have any advantage. If I apply for a job, no one looks at me as an individual, according to a meritocracy and if I'm good enough. I am judged by the law as a white person. So inevitably, the law, in a sense, forces you to start aligning yourself towards the collective. And I mean, like I said, we do have anarchic tendencies, as you can say, and in this state as we are, it's quite easy to get that. But we also recognize it's almost impossible to kind of move towards a sort of an anarchic free society here at the moment, because the collective state is so ingrained in everyone. You have to take steps towards it, and probably the first step is to create an ethno state first, and then try and create a sort of free society in that way.
We're gonna take a break for 1 minute. I just have to go I have to go close the window. There's just some rain getting in, but I'll be back in about 1 minute. Sorry about that, gentlemen.
Cool, no problem.
Sorry about that.
Wish we had rain.
True.
I'm waiting for an advertisement to come on.
All right. My apologies. I'm back. As you were saying that, I mean, from your perspective, it's kind of a lot different that, because I mean, the liberals here, what they say is that, I mean, they're thinking of it in terms of equality. They're kind of thinking of it in terms of, well, I'm going to do this because it's kind of the virtuous thing to do. And what they'll say is that people like me, or even they'll say about you guys too. They'll say that you guys are racist. They'll say that, and I personally I don't really care what they say about me, but it's like from your perspective, when it's actually this equality, it goes way beyond just saying you acknowledge your white privilege. I mean, for you guys, it goes on to giving up your entire livelihood. It's a lot more difficult to do it in that case.
Yeah, I think it's we kind of live that reality that you guys are creating, for the next decade or so. So to put it into perspective, when one of our politicians on a weekend sings a Kill the Boer song, or they do some rhetoric, it actually it shows like a spike, an increase in crime the next week, especially with all the farm murders that occurs, as you can see on farmland. You can literally measure there's certain spikes in crime after certain rhetoric. So when we talk about sort of the mob attacking you, and you have to form a collective, it is kind of a real scenario, and we are faced with, I think we're faced with the inequality in reality more every day. So it kind of we don't really buckle to someone calling us racist. We really don't care, because we live the reality away a lot more against sort of the abstract, shall I say, discussion that happens in your side. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, because I mean, what they'll I mean, and this is also true in South Africa. What they'll say is that the white populations are richer, and that I mean, in South Africa it is still true that on average the whites are a lot richer than the black population. But I mean, when it actually comes to having to give up, your own kind of material wealth and your own kind of means of providing for your family and providing for yourself, and then really kind of your own kind of means of continuing really your own kind of cultural ethnic group. I mean, when you're put in that situation, you're a lot less likely to kind of cave to this narrative, because you might say, well, we don't, we're inequal. We don't want like other people to suffer, but at the same time, we're not going to give up our own self-preservation in order to fulfill this narrative.
You see that in that respect, yes, it's true. I mean, like the white population here is wealthy, yeah, but by no means rich. Fine, you'd have your top percenters, but there's a huge middle class, and which is mostly white. And in that respect, those are your tax cows. Those are the ones that pay tax and that support literally the whole country. And it's the same for farmers. People say, but farmers have land, that means they must be rich. That means they must have this and that. Unfortunately, farmers are some of the most in-debt businessmen or individuals in this country. The debts just on owning a land, on being able to make back that money it's huge. So when the rhetoric gets pushed, but we need to kill the farmers, or we need to take the land, what happens is it's a huge knock-on effect. The politicians affect their own ethnic their own ethnic interests or their own people, purely because most farms make use of laborers who are mostly black, who would essentially be affected by losing jobs, losing their livelihood, and they support a farm worker usually would support a huge family. So the farmer not only supports himself, his own family, the community, and most likely many parts of the country with his produce, but he supports the families of his workers as well as his workers. So there's this huge knock-on effect where if a farmer gets killed, that farm stalls, the farm gets sold, goes into disrepair, the families go without food and work. It's a huge knock-on effect. So it's not just one farm that gets affected. And then as a result, investment and interest in the country fails, and the agricultural sector fails, and it brings even more of a burden on the country. And it's exactly the same with the middle class, with those in the cities. Higher tax means that you don't actually have much of your own money just to be able to survive. And by default, you support the politicians that spout anti-white rhetoric at you. So it's such an insane, it's an absurd cycle that we go through here, especially where the media and the rhetoric is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like with the democratic system, there's really no way of counterbalancing that, because when the demographics get to the point where they are, I mean, and I know in South Africa it's more of a result of kind of the history is a lot longer, whereas in Europe and North America it's the result of immigration. But nonetheless, when the demographics get to where they are, you really don't have any ability to push back against that through the democratic system, because the votes are with the other ethnic groups, and that they can rally these votes, and there really is nothing you can really do about it.
Yeah, unfortunately. Unfortunately, in terms of demographics, migration is a huge issue, and the refugee crisis, so-called refugee crisis in Europe and most of the West. In South Africa during apartheid times, there was a huge influx of blacks from the other African countries because South Africa was so successful. And it wasn't just the white cities or the white aspects of the country that was successful. The overall success of the country allowed other separated um, localities. It would be referred to as Bantustans, which would essentially be self-determined black communities, and they were just as prosperous, not maybe as prosperous as the whites, obviously, but they did well. They didn't suffer as much as what they do now, and and you still have a huge migration of people coming from Africa purely because Africa is so poor in general. In South Africa, despite all the issues we face, despite the constant hammering at us and the threat of farms being taken away and property being taken away, we still have migration this way. We still have migrants and illegal ones too. And then that causes even more xenophobia amongst the local blacks. And to just put that even into a bit better perspective, we've got 11 official languages in this country that are recognized. And that doesn't take into account any other African languages above, above the border of South Africa. It's just, it's the multicultural thing, the Rainbow Nation ideal is such a preposterous idea once you actually live the reality.
Yeah, because once you have it, once you really have it in a way that, in the way that is in South Africa, what you end up with is kind of different groups grappling for power, and really kind of what it ends up with it in the democratic system is that might makes right. So really, whoever kind of has the most votes, they really can control really the way that the country goes.
Yeah, the problem with the democratic system in this sense is, well, it's not as if you get you're not always able to vote on the choice that you want. It's not like we get a referendum for every aspect of our lives. When the reality, statistically, that your vote really doesn't make any difference at all. And then you look at the fact that maybe the only group that actually represents maybe half of your views or the policies that you would like to employ, which you would like to maybe not have the farmlands taken away, and you might want to scrap some of the affirmative action laws. That group, historically has a support of 0.05%, and it has 12 members. Again, realistically, what choice do you really have? So this fallacy that democracy gives anyone a choice is obviously very false. I mean, literally, you could just statistically look at it. Take America, how many times did one vote swing the whole election? Almost never. So hence, do you really have a say, is the question.
Yeah, and I think that another thing that's really kind of playing out is that because the kind of the idea that the West really has is that man in nature should want to be equal. He's this kind of liberal, democratic, democracy loving individual in nature. When I really don't think that's true, because what I see happening is that here in Canada and in the United States, there's so much brainwashing that goes on in order for to get the majority population to feel guilt, and there's just so much. They just do so much work to to push the idea that standing up for your own interests is amoral. The narrative really is that standing up for your own interest is akin to fascism. It's akin to Hitler. But I mean, when you see systems like in South Africa, where the majority population hasn't really been taught that that standing up for their own interests is amoral. On the contrary, they've been taught that they must stand up for their own interests. I mean, what it seems is that eventually they'll vote against a wealthier minority group.
Yeah, like interesting what you say is when you say you're taught that men and nature should be equal. I mean, I would go as far as saying it. Not only is it not true, it is completely irrational. I mean, all things in nature generally are unequal. No man is equal. I'm not even equal to the man I was a year ago. So it is in a sense that we allow this irrationality to seep in into society that creates these situations. And you could always say like there's a lack of education and all of that, but there comes a point when um, even education might not even solve the problem, because again, like we've said, there is genetic, cultural, IQ differences wherein there is the studies that show below a certain IQ you cannot actually run a functional democracy, meaning you can't move toward a first world country, and that's if an IQ average is below 90. You can't. And I mean, South Africa's average IQ is, I think, in the 80s. So, in essence, here, just to think, to scientifically say we can practice democracy here is a false.
Yes, because I mean, it kind of just it is natural for for people to kind of stand up for their own group. I mean, when your ancestors went to Africa, I mean, there wasn't someone teaching them there wasn't someone teaching them you have to stand up for your own people. I mean, when the British and when the British went to Canada and the French, I mean, no one told them you have to stand up for your own ethnic group. And I mean, because what they'll say today is that, it's like systems of racism, systems of oppression. I mean, it really just seems that these things were really what naturally developed. And it really seems that the egalitarian one is what really is the social construct.
Yeah, that's the postmodern lie. Personally, and especially in reference to you saying what's natural, our ancestors would have done what was natural, and that was to be amongst your own, to do what you can for your own. There was a better sense of community. We've lost that. We're so atomized and into, no one can agree on anything. Fine, you won't have people agreeing on anything in general, but we are so atomized and distanced from each other that there's no tribal mindset or no communal mindset amongst whites in South Africa, and it's true for the West too, the Greater West. But here in South Africa, and this is one of the ideas that I personally grapple with, especially while doing this, is specifically the alt-right has aspects that I find to be in tune with what is natural. And if anyone who knows what the 14 words are, would understand that is a sort of a signal to say, but just do what you can for your own people and ensure that you have a future not only for your children, but the children of your neighbor, or the guy down the street, or even the guy in the other city who is remotely genetically connected to you. So that is something that I think whites need to, or those of European descent need to understand and really take to heart. I think to save not only our own demographic problem, because I mean our population isn't growing as quickly as the others are in general, and specifically, we need to have that mindset that our grandfathers or great-grandfathers, our great-grandparents would have had, in the sense that be there for your own people. And that's when you have more prosperous communities and countries, is when you've got people working together, especially when your own interests are tied to the interests of your kin, and their future.
Yeah, and that's kind of really just what I think is the mindset that every human in nature, regardless of what ethnicity they're part of, I think that's kind of just what they're born with, and kind of just what's natural, because a parent in nature will always look out for its descendants. It'll always look out for its offspring, and that's kind of just what's natural. And it's the kind of the big lie that was really forced upon people, that it's amoral to do such a thing. And I wanted to ask, do you guys see any comparisons between South Africa today and what you in the United States, and where you could see the United States or Canada or even Europe going in the future?
without a doubt. There's to maybe just to use a simple example. Since the ANC came into power, there's been and this has happened now all across the West. It's not only, say, in the US, for instance, but since the ANC came into power, there's been a huge demand and push, and it's usually just by the guys who are in power, and the people generally don't even care about this facet, and that is the changing of names, changing of history, and changing of or destroying statues or changing statues. Um, we had quite a few issues with that over the years, and the only people who really stand up for that heritage would immediately be called racist or far right or whatever you want to put in that slot that would be derogatory. There are just as a minor example, there are similarities in the US. Recently, what is it, a year or two ago now, that you had the attempt at Southern heritage, which inevitably resulted in the Unite the Right in Charlottesville, the clash there. You've got aspects, that there's this idea of taking down all the Rhodes statues across the West. It's only happening in the West, this attack on history. And that attack happened in South Africa, and it still happens to this day. There's constantly debates over statues about our history, and the majority see the statues and they don't actually get taught what it's about and so on. It only gets enforced to say, but these are the oppressors, so why do we want statues of them around? And that I've seen, at least in the news and in discussion with quite a few people, that's the same thing that's happening on a certain level in the West at large. And you might have examples of that happening in Canada. But that is something that is just it's a small. It's not okay. It's a huge thing, but it's just a small facet involved in the multicultural deceit that one will expect in the US. And I mean, the US itself, especially Canada, but the US itself, there's a huge divide now amongst left and right. Identity politics is taking foot, and one can argue, but it's part of a cyclical nature. I mean, 100 years ago, there was the rise of nationalism in response to the rise of communism, for instance, of Bolshevism. So that's pretty much what's happening in South Africa, is because people were nationalistic, and it was tied to culture, it was tied to ethnicity. That was broken down. So you have a facet of that, the whites, and maybe another example which ties into this is you have the whites that say, but okay, our history is tainted, or we have to feel guilty about our history. And I mean, that you guys also experience on that side. You have to feel guilty about your history. Apartheid was evil. So, no one wants to look at the history, because we just get this broad brush stroke, and especially in schools, the indoctrination is severe. The education system here is rubbish, by the way. So the thing that they always manage to put in is the oppression of the other groups by the whites. So you have those aspects that are part of it, and unfortunately, that ends up being. South Africa is definitely the projection for what the rest of the West can expect, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that I think that a lot of people just don't really realize that, because until it actually affects them, they're not going to do anything about it, because they're kind of just waiting until because for the average white person in the United States, maybe it might not really have a big effect on them, but then kind of when down the road, it's going to really start to they're going to be demanded of more than just saying you're so-called not racist. And then I think the other thing that they'll do is that redefining terms. I mean, like the biggest example is the term racism being redefined, in that it used to mean prejudice based on race. Now it means prejudice based on race plus institutional power, whatever on earth that even means. But I mean, one thing is that I think that you can look at someone like Julius Malema. He'll go all day talking about how racist the white people are, and he'll even say like how he'll even say that all the mixed race people, the colored people, they'll say that they're racist against Africans also, and it's just racism. But then he'll go off and sing "Kill the Boer." And I mean, I think that the thing is, he's not really using the phrase racism because it makes any sense, because the phrase really doesn't make sense. He's using it because he knows that it can get him power. Like, I don't think that he really cares if white people in South Africa don't like him, because he obviously hates them. So I don't think he really cares what they think of him. He's just using that as a phrase that will rile up support for his cause, and that will really help him get his way.
Yeah, it's a word that is completely. Sorry, it's a word that it is completely lost. It's completely lost its meaning.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, here, like I said, we have a case recently where a woman, Vicky Momberg, was basically sent to jail for 3 years and basically, obviously, the mainstream media kind of accuses her and portrays it as that she is being jailed for racism, and they use ridiculous terms like the first real racist convict in our history. And I stand on correction, but it was she was jailed for hate speech or hate speech laws, but correct me if I'm wrong there. But yeah, for us, it really is that thing. If people come to us with, trying to create guilt in us with words like racist and white privilege, it really doesn't have the same effect here. I think on a personal level, in a way, as it has in America. In America, it's still very much an ideological sort of abstract war in a way to kind of get people to feel guilty, which in the end we know it's there to control them. The only reason why the word racist is used is for people to enable resource transfer through guilt. But here, because like I said, our politicians that we face, it's not subtle. Racist. It is not a subtle, slow brainwashing war on us. It is direct. We are told that we are going to shoot you. We are going to take your stuff. We're told. So it's the game is given away. We are not sitting here trying to convince people like, you shouldn't take our land. You shouldn't attack us. We are preparing. We're at the stage where we are preparing. We know what's happening. It is basically it's going to be civil war at some point, and things like that don't really have the same effect because it doesn't bother. It's just like water off a duck's back. If you understand what I mean?
Yeah,
because just to add to that, specifically regarding scare tactics. Fine, you can call someone a in overseas, in the US, and that calling someone a Nazi, there's that stigma attached to it, so everyone just sort of recoils and, oh, that's, sort of the new race card, race word to use to scare people. Over here, you've got far more severe scare tactics, and it started slowly and then it took up speed. There was an instance, Vicky Momberg was the most recent case, and she was jailed for what would be described as crimen injuria. So in other words, she basically harmed the police officer that she called. It's basically our version of the N-word. She called him. She injured him with her words, and a few years ago there was a woman, Penny Sparrow. All she did was point out how, and it's very. What happens is, there's a huge outrage and huge uproar about someone saying something, and what happened was, she mentioned something along the lines of, this. There was a beach that was filthy after a New Year's celebration or something like that, and said, people mess on these beaches like a bunch of monkeys, and that, upset the whole apple cart. The woman had to go into hiding. She had to pay a fine for being a race baiter, and so it was a huge issue. And it's what happens is the crimen injuria charge was a clear scare tactic to force people to basically scare the white populace into not standing up, and I hope that has the reverse effect. But we definitely are so we are being told, that in no uncertain terms that they're coming for us, and whether or not they're going to do it, whether or not the politicians are actually going to come for land, come for property, that's up for debate. But they're definitely putting it out there, and whether or not that they might not commit the crimes or the hatred or enact on that rhetoric, their followers will, and their followers certainly do. And that's the issue. The politicians clearly know what they're doing by baiting us with, or baiting their constituency with hate speech.
Yeah, because I mean, in the West, usually what happens when someone makes when a celebrity or someone makes like a comment that is called racist or whatever, they'll get like a Twitter hate mob come after them. They'll have like a bunch of people on Twitter, saying this, that, and then they might lose their job. And I mean, really, that's kind of, why a lot of people online are so careful with their identity, is that like that, a dox could mean that you lose your job. Whereas in South Africa, though, it's way beyond that. Whereas a dox could mean someone showing up at your house with a machete.
Yeah, no, it definitely. And the thing is, like for instance, an example of what you mentioned could be what happened with Roseanne Barr.
Yes.
That's a clear example of the bias, especially the Twitter mob. But we're in South Africa, we are on par with what happens in Germany. There was that lady Ursula Haverbeck, old lady, definitely no criminal, and all she did was, she questioned the official narrative of the Holocaust. And whatever you might think of that, is just questioning something shouldn't be illegal. Just as the same way that saying a word shouldn't put you in prison with a rapist or with someone who is a gang member. It's absurd, So it's definitely far worse on this side.
Yes. So, what do you guys think that long term the real solution to all the problems in South Africa? Like, because I think it's clear that I believe, and I think you guys believe too, is that the democratic system is not working, and that the situation is going to boil over eventually. Like, it just can't go on this way forever. So, what do you guys really see coming of it, and what do you think of any kind of solutions to that?
Yeah, no solutions. That is difficult because it really does feel like it's out of your hand. Definitely, we don't obviously engage in a sense in politics. Not going to try to form a political party and try it through the democratic process. The best outcome would obviously be for the expropriation of land not to happen, and in a sense, what we would like to see is for the white population to stand together a little bit more. If you could have a case where South Africa breaks up into different states, because sort of along cultural lines, I think it would be way more beneficial for everybody. So in a sense, how do you do that? And again, whether you do that after the war is done, while it happens, that we'll have to see. But in essence, you do what you can. And the only control that we have is, well, we prepare, we keep ourselves safe, we try and separate ourselves from the government in a way so that we can band together and, obviously try and form or get into an area where we can actually, control the whole area with like-minded people. So that is, we've talked about that before, solutions to this, and we've done documentaries on places where they have basically created a small ethno-state, and it seems that that is kind of one of the best solutions at the moment. But we're up for any debate, and we're up, not debate in a sense, but for any other opinions or ideas.
Yeah, because
the
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, the best model where that's concerned, um, self-determination, self-sufficiency. South Africa is already in, because we've got huge issues with utilities. Um, Power goes out regularly. At one point, it happened almost every day, and it stopped when there's a huge monopoly on electricity in the country. There's basically one provider, and what happened was, that there was issues with electricity, the constant brownouts, blackouts, and it was used in areas that were affected, were largely city areas. Industries were affected, so people started pushing towards solar power, towards other means of generating electricity. A huge increase in generator sales, for instance. And then we also have we've had for a few years now, we've had quite a huge drought, a severe drought. It's eased up a bit in most areas, but there are still areas that are terribly affected. Port Elizabeth is one of them, that has severe water issues, and people, it's a huge population that has limited access to water, and it's because of various factors such as, the state not making good, not being very proficient in maintaining certain levels in dams, and you've also got natural factors. So people inevitably have started moving towards aspects of self-sufficiency and self-determination on various levels. But the model that we would like to enact, at least to some degree, is sort of what you find in the small city of Orania, or the small town of Orania, which is very much a cultural ethno-state, a cultural and language ethno-state. And that seems to work, but it's small scale, and there is a huge population in South Africa, and one should ideally be able to have, at least in part, a type of republic or nationalist ideal that people can strive for and say, oh, but this area is ours, we want this, let's build up there. But the long-term solutions itself are, that there are tough choices to make, and tough realities facing decisions like that for many people, and people are far too comfortable in general, I think, still, despite the imminent danger or the imminent threat of what we face here.
I mean, it seems that. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to say, like, if we look in the last couple of years, the option that most whites have chosen is, like I said, is white flight. You've just had everyone moves their money and moves their family overseas, where they can, obviously where the economy is better, where they are safe. And again, that is, people would say that is that's the most rational choice, and I guess it is. And in our sake, that is kind of, you have to have a backup plan. You have to have you get your visa ready, you get everything ready. You might buy a property overseas so you can get away when you have to. But it is a very sad fact that you've had a group like the Afrikaners that have come and they've settled here from 1652, and have built sort of their character on the fact of self-sufficiency and independence, and running from and rebuilding, and then that is gonna die out. If you look at the statistics now, it's gonna last probably another decade or two, which it's a very sad reality to be part of something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that kind of just with the current narrative, it's that when equality is not achieved, I mean, when land expropriation without compensation, when that doesn't achieve equality, when maybe even like full-blown like confiscation of your wealth, when that doesn't achieve equality, well, it seems it only really ends in one way, and that's with civil war. I mean, because it's just it's something that can just go on forever and ever, like it has in Zimbabwe. And I just want to ask you guys, though, do you think that do you think it wouldn't be as bad if there wasn't both the current narrative that you have and the kind of the oppression narrative, which of course it's the same as in the United States and Canada. If you didn't have that narrative and there wasn't a democratic system where different groups are competing with each other in this zero-sum game for power, do you think that if you had a situation where kind of just everyone, just could form their own communities, could just kind of live their own way, and maybe there might be interaction between the two, but the thing is that you're not really competing with each other, and there isn't this kind of kind of critical theory, just like oppression Olympics between the groups. Do you think that the society could work?
In a way, they especially in South Africa, there are people who anyway work well together. Okay, look, the multicultural thing is, it's unavoidable. You work with people of various ethnicities in this country, in most fields. Administration is obviously a huge issue here. Bureaucracy, the government employs mostly black people anyway. So services are rubbish. That doesn't work. But when you look at, if all those factors were not included in the mix, people would have in any way naturally sort of moved towards their own and done their own thing. And yes, it would have eased the tension here. It would have made things easier. But what inevitably happens is South Africa has a history of this. One group rises above the rest and becomes more successful, and then the whole cycle repeats again. And then other groups who are poor or are battling want to come and also benefit from what's happening over there, not understanding that the reason why a certain group is successful is because of certain practices, certain certain aspects that are tied to their culture, to their ethnicity, to their work ethic. You can look at it in depth in many ways, and inevitably what happens is once all those factors are stripped, there will be a group that rises to the top, and then the cycle repeats.
Yeah, because it kind of just seems to happen historically that when there's a society in which there's kind of this successful minority, they always it seems that it always will result in kind of of the larger majority going after them because they have wealth and they want wealth. It just seems to be it seems to just be a zero-sum game in that grapple for that power.
No, I find it a very fascinating question, and my first thought is if that narrative wasn't there, my instinct is to think that there would have just been a different narrative. Someone would have created a different narrative because it is part of it's general human tendency. If you see another group succeed, you have one of two choices: either you can improve yourself to get to that level, or you can pull that group down. And it depends from which postmodern university you come from. Some things you can't change and some things you can. So, and generally what we find through history, as we've seen with places like Germany and Japan, after the country's completely been destroyed, they rebuild themselves in a couple of years, where you get African countries which obviously are still in the dark ages. So it is a very difficult question, and I was trying to rack through my brain, like, where in history has this actually empirically been tested, this idea of a minority group like that's a lot more successful without this sort of past history, that have in a sense been allowed to I don't want to use the word integrate, because you'll probably just have segregation, but you'll have peaceful segregation, which is in a sense what we would like. Have peaceful segregation with still voluntary sort of trade along those lines. But your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea how to enact that.
The other also important point there is the argument, for instance, against, or one of the arguments that that people put forth as to prevent the refugee crisis in the West is, for instance, why not help the people in their own countries? And that it's been put forth by, and Sweden and countries like that used to, and they still do, give, millions of dollars to African countries to support them and help them, but the money doesn't actually do much. So what we had here in South Africa, for instance, is people were segregated, people were divided, and they were able to do their own thing within their own community, their own sort of ethnic divide. But even that, just bringing that idea of helping people in their own countries onto a small scale, that's what we had here. You had, for instance, the ruling party of the white country, or the white aspect. You had them building the world's biggest hospital at that stage in one of the black townships, Soweto, and that hospital enabled a huge demographic boom for the blacks in South Africa. And it's not like they were oppressed. It's not like they were suffering. They received some of the best medical care in the world, and that allowed them to have a huge demographic boom. So, and at the moment, I think it's the world's third biggest hospital, the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. But it's deteriorating. The services there are not what it used to be. And so you can build the biggest hospital in the world, or the best hospital in the world. Whoever takes over might not have the same values or the same way of maintaining something like that. So it's difficult. The moment you try and help people where they are, they might not want to, on any scale, they might not handle that help well enough, or they might not, benefit or maintain it as well as what you might have done, for instance, or, so it's a very difficult issue in terms of, I think ultimately you have to help your own people first, and yeah, that's when it gets difficult. The bigger that help gets, the more difficult things become.
Yeah, because it kind of seems that when there's a system in which there's differing groups under under one jurisdiction, and they're kind of grappling for power, it just seems that it's almost inevitable that they're going to, unless like there's some severe social engineering going on, then the dominant group is going to eventually assert itself. And I mean, I think because the reason that in the West that it hasn't quite boiled over yet, but I think it's inevitable in the future, is that there's so much work put into preventing kind of just people, the majority population is just kind of looking out for themselves. Like you said, it's like they're educated from birth to be taught that that's evil. And it seems that that's like kind of the only way that you can have a system, a kind of multicultural system actually work. But I think though it's a ticking time bomb, because I think I don't think it matters how much diversity education you have. I think eventually human nature is just going to boil over.
Yeah, the other good point regarding that, human nature, or especially the biological aspect, you can. I'm not sure what the situation would be like in Canada in terms of no-go zones. Do you have anything like that there?
Not quite, but it looks like it's probably going to happen in the future, though.
You see now with no-go zones, especially when that started propping up in the news in Europe, in Sweden, things like that, the notion of a no-go zone that the cops can't even go to. We've had places like that in South Africa for years now. And that where biology comes in is you realize very quickly that you are in danger, or you stand out if you as a white guy go into a certain section. Like you wouldn't go into a certain township or a certain section, a certain community, because something's going to happen to you. You know it. So inherently your your biological spider senses start tingling, and then you end up realizing, but I'm actually, nothing might happen to me, but something is telling me to be cautious. So you immediate that out group aspect comes forth in a biological way, if I can put it that way. And you realize that there are differences. There once a certain demographic consolidates in a large enough area or large enough size, you definitely feel it. And the inverse, it's the same with, for instance, if a black guy comes into a very white area, they will feel uncomfortable. It's just nature. So just to add to that is, this is possibly something that you can also expect on that side of the world, where South Africa, as an example, is you just simply don't go to certain places for your own safety and it's so that you don't get robbed or mugged. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think one thing you can even observe this happening, because if you look at the maps of cities like at the demographic maps of cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and then even London in the United Kingdom, or even cities in Canada like Toronto, Vancouver, what you'll see is it'll always self-segregate. There'll always be these communities that are dominated by a certain ethnic group, and the real irony is that these cities are filled with cities like London, Toronto. They're like the white people that live in these cities are the most insufferable leftists you will ever meet, but they still only want to live with people that are similar to them, and it just seems to happen like clockwork every time. And I mean, it really kind of just plays into that idea that kind of people it just really is natural for people to kind of want to associate with their own. And I mean, I think anyone that thinks that you're not building a ticking time bomb, I really think you're just dreaming, because I mean, you can already see it happening in plenty of these countries, and I don't see it with the demographics in all these Western countries. The problem's only going to increase.
No, it's definitely the case. And one question that should be asked is, what makes a certain country successful? What makes a certain group successful? And if you look at just an example on your side of the world, is the migrant crisis. Why are these people flocking from what is ostensibly shithole tier countries? What causes them to go is the supposed prosperity. Okay, fine, you might say that Islam or something like that might have an agenda, but aside from that, what causes the third world to want to go to the first world? And it's not only 100 megabyte internet speeds, it's just successful. It's having employment, it's having healthcare or anything like that. And no one asks, what is it that makes those countries successful? And it's usually the case because they're homogenous. That's why most of Scandinavia for a very long time was successful, and why socialism worked there was purely because it was homogenous. The moment you start spreading out things like socialism to, and one can debate socialism also, but Scandinavia is a good case for why socialism worked for a long while. It's because of their homogeneity, and within that homogeneity, there is often success, especially in the northern hemisphere, amongst high IQ countries. Japan included,
But one thing you'll notice is also is that these narratives, though, they come into play immediately. I mean, I had this one guy who had been in Canada for like 2 years. He wasn't even a citizen, and he was telling me about oppression and about white privilege and about quote unquote decolonization. And I'm just thinking, like, this guy, he hasn't lived. He's not even a citizen. He hasn't lived here for his entire life. And I mean, it's just one thing that kind of made me realize that, he doesn't genuinely care about, so-called racism or whatever. What he cares about is essentially, it's about money and really about power. And that's kind of just a tool to obtain that.
Yeah, it is, like I said, it's a way to get resources to flow his side. The big difference you find where race, the use of the word races, and all the virtue signaling you find on the wealthy left in your area, it is a case of it is used as virtue signaling. Where here we would almost, if we are called racist, it's in a sense we find it a good thing because we can use it as a recruitment tool. It's a nice way for people to know which side we align with, in a sense. So it for me it's always interesting how it is almost, I won't say it's beneficial in a sense, but we kind of want attention our side so that we know who we align with. Where at your side it is still a word that supposedly has negative effects.
Yeah, I got a question in the chat. So is South Africa doing a good thing by trying to become homogeneously black?
Yeah,
well, it depends for whom.
Yeah,
it's for whom it's a good thing, and no, it's in terms of no, go for it.
No, I'm saying maybe this is the pathway to the first real Wakanda. I mean, I can't see into the future. Maybe it is, and if we don't want to stand in the way of something as beautiful as that.
yeah. So I guess we'll probably end shortly. I think one last question I'll have for you guys is like, what message would you give to Westerners that kind of reject their own culture? They reject pretty much any kind of positive European identity, and they're really kind of behind this whole multiculturalism thing because they kind of view it as morally good. I mean, what would you really say to someone like that?
Yeah, well, if that question, if you asked it and you gave us an hour, I could go on an hour rant. I would probably just first start screaming at them. I mean, it is so frustrating, and that's kind of, again, it's a personal feeling that there's people that our ancestors, and especially in the West, and you can look at all the world wars, and you can look at people who built Europe. There's been so much sacrifice to create Western civilization, and for people to take it for granted, where we can personally experience the recycling of history. And it is incredibly sad to think that I probably have to spend my whole life trying to recreate something that has been known for centuries and try and rebuild. And then hopefully, my children can live in a Western style society again. And so, it's difficult to get that through if people don't experience it. But it is just to try and stick to reality. I can't even say more than that.
Yeah, what inevitably happens is if you start discarding your history, if you start putting the stamp of evil on your history, on the successes of your ancestors, because I mean you here because of those who came before you, and we don't own anything. I mean, what we have now, we pass on to those who come after us. What it amounts to is, if you lose your history, if you lose your culture, if you discard all those important points about what makes your culture unique, about what makes your society or your culture good, including your history, if you discard that, you discard not only your future, but the future for your children. And by proxy, the Western society in the future. So that's perhaps the best way we can sum up that. Also, is what about the children? It's that's what it amounts to.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing I'd like to get across to them is that these narratives are going to play themselves out. I mean, you're not there isn't going to be this time where people are going to say, okay, now we have equality, now we've settled this alleged historical guilt, and it's going to be the future generations. I mean, it's not going to be enough to just say, I acknowledge my white privilege, I do this, I'm this virtuous person. I mean, I think that in your case, it's like these kind of narratives playing out. It's now costing. It's now costing the Afrikaners their livelihoods, and there is a good chance that within a few years it could cost them a lot more than just that.
Yeah, it is. It is the fact that the saying in that all we really live out is ideas, and ideas that actually come into practice, and then you experience it. So if you live out collective democratic ideas, then it does become a reality, and to experience it the same as communism on some level sounds wonderful and it sounds equal, but it's that movement towards empiricism, logic, and reality. It's even, I mean, that this is, I find it very frustrating when people even want to have these debates about, hate speech and white privilege. It really doesn't even exist. I don't really even know what white privilege means. It is really ridiculous that a lot of time is spent fighting about these nonsensical terms, when we have to go back just to, at a biological level, what we are. We have to stay congruent to reality, and therein that you can find happiness.
Yeah. Well, I think we had a great conversation today, guys. Thanks for coming on. Go subscribe to Boer Republic. They make some great content, both South African related and just great content in general. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for listening. Good night, gentlemen. Till next time, Endeavor. See you guys later.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.